Alright, so today we're going to do a video on talking about how to control light within your camera. I know this is confusing for a lot of people, so we're going to look at the three elements involved in basically controlling your light in camera. And then we're going to throw in a fourth element, which is off-camera flash, strobes, etc. So to begin with, let's clarify this. These three in-camera elements are to control ambient light. These are not light that you're going to add, manipulated light if you would. This is just ambient light, and this is how it's controlled in the camera, including the lens. So I've got an illustration here. I've got these tubes set up. Let's first of all talk about water. Let's pretend that this is actually a water supply line going into a city. And each of these different valves and the entry point of the main tube represents a different water source. At the end of the water here, at the end of the tube, excuse me, is basically your entry point into the city. And let's say for illustration's sake that if there's too much water entering over here, it will actually consume the city, it will flood the city and cause major problems. If there's not enough water, likewise the city will suffer because of drought. So there has to be a perfect balance. The interesting thing about these valves, there's different types of water in each one of these valves. So depending on what flavor the city wants for a particular day, depends on how much a valve is open and how much is shut. Now, let me say this, every photo that is taken, the camera is actually doing this. If you put a camera in manual, you have to enter which valve is open, how much. You're responsible for the valves. If you put the camera in automatic, the camera thinks for you. Actually, the engineers behind the camera thought through the process. So they figure out the equation. They meter the light, and then they put the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture or the f-stop, whichever you want to call it there. So that's basically what's going on here. Now obviously we're working with light, we're not working with water, but the principle still applies. If I have my ISO at 100 and my shutter speed is at 1/200th of a second and my aperture is at f2, depending on how much ambient light, and by the way this is representative of ambient light, and by ambient light we're referring to the available light in a situation that is natural. So for example, if you're in a room and there's just one candle, that is your ambient light that you're working with. If you're outside in the sun, that represents as well the ambient light that's available. So this is just available light right now. In a little while we'll talk about strobes and off-camera flash, but first I want to focus on this and get you to understand that. So let's say that instead of at f2 I decide to turn up my turn down my aperture, say to f8. So by turning that valve, now I have to either turn up my shutter speed in order to get, it was at 1/200th of a second, now I have to up my shutter speed. In other words, it needs to close quicker, it needs to close slower. So I need to allow more light to get into the shutter speed or crank up my ISO. So if I lower my aperture from f1.8 or f2 as we're using for illustration's sake, and I up that to f8, then my shutter speed has to be slowed down in order to get the right balance, or my ISO has to increase, say up to 1600 for my ISO. You know, one of these two things has to happen, or both. I could actually slow down to 1/100th of a second and then crank this up to 1/1000th of a second. I'm just using again an illustration. But these have to work in balance with one another in order for the water to come out perfectly on this end. And that is what a properly exposed picture, this is representative of that. So these three tools are vitally important to get the right outcome of the picture. Now let's talk about these individual things, and then we'll talk about some of the flavors that we talked about, how these are different flavors, what style picture you're going for determines how these are used. All right, let's say here that we're talking about ISO. I personally, and I think this is kind of standard across the profession, I do everything I can to get my ISO at 100, 200. Those are the two, that's basically what I shoot at. Now, I have shot as high as 6,000 ISO. The Canon 6D does very well in low light. I don't like to do that, but there have been times that I have to do it where flash is not available. I will put a high aperture lens on and go with it. But this is what I typically like to do. I like to put my ISO at 100. The higher, or let's put it this way, the more I open up this valve, the more light comes through. Really, with ISO, it's a little tricky because what ISO is sensitivity of the sensor. So in other words, when I crank up my ISO, this sensor is going to catch more light quickly. It's ready to catch light. The higher, the more sensitive it is to light. The problem with this is, if you've noticed pictures that look really grainy, the pixels start getting kind of blown out. It causes the picture to look grainy because the sensor is so sensitive to light. So the higher the ISO, the more grainy, again, because it's more sensitive. And that's why it's always good to keep your ISO down as much as possible. 100, 200, up to 400. On the Canon 60D, on the Rebels, even the 5D Mark II, I would recommend not going over 400 ISO. On the Canon 6D, some of the newer Canon cameras, and even some of the new Nikon cameras, you can go up as high as 1,000 and still have great shots. The 5D Mark III as well. It's not as good as the 6D as far as low light shooting, but that's the flavor of ISO. If you're in a low light situation, this is what you should consider manipulating once the others are where you want them. This is going to allow you to the ability to shoot in very low light and still get a picture out of a situation. And again, a picture is better than no picture, and that's something to keep in mind as you're shooting. I'd rather just raise up the ISO and get a capture than to not raise it and not get a capture at all. So let's look at shutter speed. What is shutter speed good for? Well, here's an example of having a high shutter speed. You can do this with flash as well, which we'll talk about in a minute. But having a high speed allows the camera to capture motion and freeze it. High speeds are used in sports specifically because of all the motion, capturing kids, and here's an example of that. In order to get that shot, in order to freeze the frame, you need a high shutter speed. But when you have a high shutter speed, you don't have as much light coming in as, say, if you dropped it down to 1/60th of a second or left it for 3 seconds wide open. That's going to allow a lot of light to come in to that sensor. So if I'm shooting at a priority of shutter speed, then I'm going to have to balance these other two out in accordance so that I get that great shot that I'm looking for. So the shutter speed is the flavor of sports, for example. If you're wanting to capture your children jumping and freeze them in the air, or you're doing a wedding shot and you want the bride and groom throwing each other in the water or cake in the face, you may want to crank up that shutter speed if you can do it and freeze that frame. Make sure you get that frame frozen. All right, let's talk about the aperture, or the f-stop. Obviously, for most photographers, this is one of the favorite valves, if you would, to talk about, of letting light in, controlling light. And not only does this flavor really kind of control the wow factor, controls the depth of field, it really is reflective of the lens that you have as well. This is a major point for what lens you have. The higher the number, the more in focus you're going to have in the entire picture. The lower the number, the higher the aperture. And I know that's confusing, but for example, if you have an f-stop of 1.4, that's a low number, but it's a high aperture. So the higher the aperture, the lower the number. An aperture of f4, for example, is a mid-range portrait aperture. The f8, for example, is a good studio aperture setting. And that allows you to get a lot in focus rather than just a narrow depth of field. I'm going to put a picture here that you can see. This is what depth of field looks like. Notice, if you would, how as you lower the aperture, again, that's raising the number. As you lower the aperture from 1.8 all the way up to f22 or f20 as an example, as you lower the aperture, you're going to get more depth of field, which means more is going to be in focus. So if you're after landscape photography, you're going to want to probably start at f11 or higher in most cases, and that's going to give everything in focus for you. If you're shooting portraits, you're going to want to go as high as you can on your aperture, and that means as low a number as your lens will allow. And you'll see a number, every lens has an aperture, a highest aperture setting and a lowest aperture setting. Some of them have manual aperture settings, others have automatic or in-camera control. So those are all things to consider too when you're choosing this lens. When the aperture is opened all the way, the camera lens is going to allow as much light as is possible into the camera with that lens. So if the highest aperture is f4, then it's going to open up to f4. If it's if you lower the aperture to say f14, it's going to go like this and allow just a lot less light in it. If you go to f20, it's going to get as small as hole, or f22 is typical for lenses. It's going to get the smallest hole that lens can. So it's not letting a lot of light in. In fact, if you put your camera settings at a balanced capture, if you put it exposure at balanced, and then you change the f-stop, or you change the aperture all the way from f4 to say f22, you're going to notice the picture goes black. That's because it's not letting a lot of light in. You're going to have to change your shutter speed and or your ISO in order to get that effect that you're looking for. So the aperture here is very important. I will say that I shoot in manual mode, but I know a lot of photographers that actually shoot in, they actually choose to shoot in aperture priority mode. And I've got another camera here, and I'll just show you what I'm talking about. Typically that is registered as AV on most cameras, Canon cameras, excuse me. They register it as AV, and that is basically you're shooting in aperture priority mode. That means that you put in the aperture that you want. If you're doing portraits, you would put in, for example, f1.8. You're shooting with your 85 1.8, and you put in the aperture of 1.8, and then the camera figures everything else out for you. It will figure out your shutter speed and your ISO. That's going to give you different flavors depending on what kind of picture you're looking for. And those are the three elements involved in getting the right light to come out, if you would, to getting a balanced exposure. These valves getting controlled as they're supposed to be controlled.